there is a reasonably convincing amount of evidence suggesting that it's very possible that when muscles are doing this high intensity activity and we are seeing this acidosis developing, the acidosis might not be, catastrophically impacting the actual contractile function of the fiber itself, but it might be sending signals back to the nervous system that the nervous system, of course, is responding to, saying, hey, shit hurts down there. Things are going pretty intense. We're making a lot of energy very quickly, which, of course, is a threatening thing to any living organism. So the idea is that there is some kind of complex communication going on with these receptors and the nervous system that is potentially contributing to fatigue, but from more neurally mediated centers. And the idea is that the muscle fibers themselves can still work in that pH, but upstream there are nervous, signals from the nervous system telling the muscle, I know you can work, but maybe don't.
Like some like central governor hypothesis stuff.
Yeah. So the idea is that the nervous system is basically decreasing some of that motor neuron firing to reduce muscle output due to fatigue that is being sensed at the central level in response to peripheral metabolite accumulation. That's the one area that I think might help us understand what might be going on here. So it's a lot more complex than just putting a muscle fiber in a bath.
Yeah. That's basically what I threw out as just a wild guess before we started recording.
Yeah, that is true. Now, that's, like I said, there's two lines of research I find really interesting. That's one of them. I think it's very compelling. If I had to put my money on one, I'd say that probably explains most of the confusion involved with acidosis, fatigue, and buffers as ergogenic ingredients. There is also some research that I'll put in the show notes where they specifically were looking at the independent effect. This was back to very mechanistic in vitro stuff with isolated fibers. So what they were looking at is the independent effect of elevated pH, elevated proton concentration or reduced pH, acidosis basically. They were looking at the independent effect of acidosis, the independent effect of inorganic phosphate accumulation, which you mentioned last episode, and then the combined effect of the two of them at varying temperature levels and in varying muscle fiber types. And of course, as you can gather from that explanation of the study, the results, very nitty-gritty, hard science stuff going on here. But the very simplified result kind of summary is that the collective, the combined effect of having low pH and a lot of inorganic phosphate had a much bigger effect on force and power output of the muscle fiber than either aspect individually. And that effect was most pronounced at lower temperatures, but still persisted at temperatures that replicate physiological exercise-like temperatures. It was exaggerated in type 2 fibers, more so than type 1 fibers. And like I said, that combined effect was much larger than the independent effect of either one. There seems to be some degree of synergy there. So I think inorganic phosphate definitely still, if I had to put my finger on one metabolite that is likely to be directly driving fatigue, I would still put it on inorganic phosphate. But it does seem like there is a synergistic relationship by which the acidosis that develops during fatigue and high intensity exercise, that is kind of working with inorganic phosphate to produce this progression of fatigue during high intensity exercise. So it looks like, you could look at the more neural route and get some explanations. You can look at some of these more sophisticated, updated in vitro studies that have built upon some of these revelations related to acidosis and temperature. There is a narrative that is coming together, and you can start to see some of the aspects of how we will eventually understand fatigue progression during very high intensity glycolytic exercise. there's enough here to say, I think we're starting to notice the main characters of the story a little bit, but there's still some work to do to put together the relative contributions of how this all fits together. But at the very least, I don't think we're in a position where we say buffers work, but it makes no sense at all why.
Yeah.
But I think we are at a position where we say buffers work, but it's a hell of a lot more complicated than just saying if you can keep, buffering protons a little better, fatigue will be delayed in perpetuity. There's a lot more that seems to be going on here with fatigue. It looks like buffering some of those protons can be helpful, but the story with muscle fatigue is very, very complicated, and there's a lot of moving parts there. So hopefully this provides a little bit of clarity related to our previous segment, and hopefully, my God, I hope this is just one additional little anecdote that leads you to be a little more skeptical of content creators who just take a mechanism and run with it.
Yeah.
And just kind of speculate based on mechanisms, because you can only speculate on a mechanism that and derive actionable kind of practical takeaways if you assume that we already know everything about the processes involved, and that there will be absolutely no downstream effects you haven't accounted for and no other moving pieces that you haven't accounted for. So we've talked in past shows about, where we fit on the spectrum between, how much you rely on mechanisms and theory, how much you rely on empirical data. I think we both tend to rely a lot on empirical data whenever it's available, because this is just one additional instance where stuff gets complicated in the body. And there are a lot of processes where there are overlapping mechanisms and redundant mechanisms and synergistic mechanisms, and most notably mechanisms that we don't know about yet.
Yeah.
And so trying to take mechanisms and just say, oh, yeah, I have a perfect series of strategies to exploit that. It can be done sometimes, but it gets messy.
Yeah.